After being condemned to death despite his innocence, Jesus was crucified between two thieves. He spent around 6 hours on the cross until he died. It was now likely Friday of the week that began with Jesus entering Jerusalem. Although Jesus' sacrifice had been made, the story was not complete. As we look now at the text involving Jesus' resurrection, we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 23 and verse 50 through chapter 24 and verse 35. Let's begin by noticing that Jesus' body is buried. Luke 23, verses 50 through 56. It says, "There was a good and righteous man named Joseph, a member of the Sanhedrin, who had not agreed with their plan and action. He was from Arimathea, a Judean town, and was looking forward to the kingdom of God. He approached Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Taking it down, he wrapped it in fine linen and placed it in a tomb cut into the rock, where no one had ever been placed. It was the preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed along and observed the tomb and how his body was placed. Then they returned and prepared spices and perfumes, and they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment." As we look at this handful of verses in verses 50 through 56, we see Jesus' death. It had been confirmed. Luke does not record about this, but John does. In John chapter 19, verses 31 through 37, there was no doubt that Jesus was dead as the Roman soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear. And out of it came blood and water. There was no doubt that Jesus had died. And now we see this man named Joseph from Arimathea, which is a town about 20 miles northwest of Jerusalem. And Joseph requested Jesus' body from Pilate so he could bury it before the Sabbath began. So Jesus, his body was taken off the cross, was wrapped in fine linen, and placed into a new tomb. Nobody had ever been laid before. Matthew 27, verses 57 through 61, you can read about it. Mark 15, verses 42 through 47. John 19, verses 38 through 42 as well. Now, Joseph was a good and a righteous man. Some things that we find out about him. Right? He's a good, righteous man. He's a prominent member of the Sanhedrin. He's rich. And he's one who was looking forward to the kingdom of God. So he's looking forward to this messianic kingdom. And we find out he's a secret disciple of Jesus due to fear of the Jews. Matthew 27, verse 57, John 19, verse 38. You can also go back to John 9, verse 22, maybe see some indication of why someone would be afraid of the Jews and be able to just come out and say that you're a follower of Jesus when he's, again, a prominent member of the Sanhedrin. Same thing, John 12, verse 42. Go look at those passages. So this is the man who now comes to Pilate, asks for Jesus' body so it can be buried, and is put in this tomb that nobody had ever been laid in before. Well, despite being part of the Sanhedrin. Now remember, the Sanhedrin had condemned Jesus to death. Okay, so he is part of the Sanhedrin that condemned Jesus to death. Mark 14, verse 64. But Joseph, we see it, did not agree with putting Jesus to death. Now, how did the Sanhedrin all agree in putting him to death and Joseph not agree? Well, there might be some different explanations for that. Maybe Joseph absented himself from the decision, or maybe he just kept silent. Right? The text doesn't go into exhaustive detail on that, but it just tells us those two pieces, and there's different ways that those pieces can fit together. But we see he did not agree with putting Jesus to death, and thus Jesus was with a rich man at his death. Isaiah 53, verse 9, as had been prophesied, as he's buried in this rich man's tomb. Now, his burial likely took place on Friday. Or you remember, as we read in this text, it is during the preparation day before the Sabbath, in the hours between his death, which happened around 3 p.m., and the beginning of the Sabbath, which began around 6 p.m. Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 and 23, talked about how someone who hangs on a cross or hangs on a tree is cursed and they're not to be left overnight. And so, all of this also in fulfillment of the law that God had given. And so, the next day is the Sabbath. Here in just a few hours, roughly at the time of Jesus' death. And so this man, who's a righteous man, didn't agree with Jesus being put to death, now asks for his body so he can put it in his own tomb. Again, probably late on Friday, according to Jewish time, and spends just part of the day in the tomb there on that Friday. Well, the women who followed Jesus from Galilee, we've seen various women as we've read through the book of Luke here. And these women who followed Jesus from Galilee went to see Jesus's burial. Then they returned to their residences and prepared spices and perfumes for Jesus's body. We'll see more about that here in the next section. But they're preparing on this day, on this time in between, and they rested on the Sabbath according to God's command. I also want you to note, Luke does not record all as much about this, but there was a large stone that was placed in front of the tomb, Matthew 27, verse 60, and this stone was then sealed, and the tomb was guarded so that Jesus' body would not be stolen. Matthew 27, verses 61 through 66, the Jewish leaders were concerned that Jesus' disciples might come, steal away his body, and say he had risen from the dead, since he claimed that he would rise from the dead. So the stone is, this large stone's rolled in front of the opening. It is sealed, and there's a guard set in front of it. And that brings us then into Luke chapter 24, where we see that Jesus has risen. Luke 24, verses 1 through 12. It says, on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came to the tomb, bringing the spices they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. They went in, but did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men stood by them in dazzling clothes. So the women were terrified and bowed down to the ground. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? Asked the men. He is not here, but he has risen. Remember how he spoke to you when he was in Galilee, saying, it is necessary that the Son of Man be betrayed into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and rise on the third day. And they remembered his words. Returning from the tomb, they reported all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, And the other women with them were telling the apostles these things. But these words seemed like nonsense to them, and they did not believe the women. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. When he stopped to look in, he saw only the linen cloths. So he went away amazed at what had happened. So let's focus in on the first 8 verses for now. It was now the first day of the week. It was now Sunday. The Sabbath is over. And the women who had prepared the spices and perfumes that we just read about in the previous section, that now they came to the tomb very early in the morning. When they arrived, they found the stone rolled away from the tomb, having been moved by an angel, if you look at Matthew 28 and verses 1 through 4. So they entered the tomb and didn't find Jesus' body. And they were perplexed. Can you just imagine these women who had been with Jesus, they'd seen Jesus' body be put in this tomb, and now they come back on the first day of the week, bringing these spices and perfume that they had prepared for his body. And now his body's gone. And they're perplexed and they're terrified, and they bowed when two angels, Mark 16, verse 5, John 20, verses 11 through 13, now stood by them in dazzling clothes. What a sight that must have been. And these men, these angels, asked why the women were looking for the living among the dead, and urged them to remember how Jesus had spoken in Galilee to foretell his betrayal, crucifixion, and resurrection on the third day. Essentially, don't you remember that this is exactly what he said was going to happen? You can go back into Luke chapter 9, verses 21 and 22. You can find out that's still in this region of Galilee. Mark 8, verses 31 to 33. Mark 9, verse 30 through 32. You can go read as well other accounts of this in Matthew 28, verses 5 to 7, and Mark 16, verses 6 through 7. Here are these two angels saying, why are you seeking the living among the dead? He's not here. He has risen just as he said. Don't you remember the words that he spoke to you, that he would suffer, he would die, and he would rise on the third day? And here they were, right now on the third day. You get to the third day by calculating that his body was placed in the tomb late on Friday. Okay, so part of the day on Friday, all day on Saturday, and part of the day on Sunday. This is very early in the morning on the first day of the week. So we've got Jesus in the tomb for part of these 3 days, fulfilling the words that he had said. And these angels reminding the women about what Jesus had said when he was with them. And then the women remembered his words. As we go on then into verses 9 through 12, we find out the women were to go and tell the apostles Jesus had risen. Matthew 28, verses 7 and 8. Now, there's some difficulty knowing the exact sequence of events concerning those who came and left the tomb. Okay, there's some different things you can go and research about it to see maybe the exact order of events, but it's really inconsequential. But you can certainly harmonize or try to harmonize how these events happen at the tomb concerning the comings and goings of people. Matthew 28, for example, verses 1 through 10, Mark 16, verses 1 to 13, this passage in Luke chapter 24, verses 1 to 12, and John 20, verses 1 through 18. There's all 4 of the gospel records that talk about this this resurrection event on the first day of the week, and the people who come to the tomb and they find it's empty. But while you can try to harmonize those events, and there's some difficulty in knowing exactly the sequence that occurred, it is clear that the resurrected Jesus appeared to the women. Jesus appeared to the women in Matthew 28, verses 9 through 10, and Mark 16, verses 9 to 13 says that he first appeared to Mary Magdalene. And so Jesus had risen from the dead. The tomb was empty. People are coming to his tomb, finding the tomb empty. And Jesus appears to these women, including Mary Magdalene. Well, news was reported to the apostles and the other disciples. Jesus' tomb is empty. And these words seem like nonsense to them. And they did not believe the women. However, Peter and also John, according to John 20, verses 1 through 10, now Peter's the only one who's focused on here in this particular text. Peter got up and ran to the tomb. John also is there with him, according to John 20, verses 1 through 10 at some point. And Peter got up and ran to the tomb, looked into the tomb, and saw only the burial clothes, with the wrapping that had been over his head folded in a separate place. Again, go read John 20 and notice that account that's given. And he went away amazed at what had happened. Now, let's go on into verses 13 through 35, and we see Jesus appears to two men. The text reads, "Now that same day, two of them were on their way to a village called Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. Together, they were discussing everything that had taken place. And while they were discussing and arguing, Jesus himself came near and began to walk among them. But they were prevented from recognizing him. Then he asked them, 'What is this dispute that you're having with each other as you're walking?' And they stopped walking and looked discouraged. Then one named Clopas answered him, 'Are you the only visitor in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that happened there in these days?' 'What things?' he asked them. So they said to him, 'The things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, powerful in action and speech before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we were hoping that he was the one who was about to redeem Israel. Besides all this, it's the third day since these things happened. Moreover, some women from our group astounded us. They arrived early at the tomb. When they didn't find his body, they came and reported that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they didn't see him.' He said to them, 'How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Wasn't it necessary for the Messiah to suffer these things and enter into his glory?' Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted for them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. They came near the village where they were going, and he gave the impression that he was going further. But they urged him, saying, 'Stay with us, because it's almost evening, and now the day is almost over.' So he went in to stay with them. It was as he reclined at the table with them that he took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, but he disappeared from their sight. They said to each other, "Weren't our hearts burning within us while he was talking with us on the road and explaining the scriptures to us?" That very hour, they got up and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and those with them gathered together, who said, "The Lord has truly been raised and has appeared to Simon." And they began to describe what had happened on the road and how he was made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Let's begin with verses 13 through 16 of this chapter. Luke has given proof of Jesus' resurrection thus far through the empty tomb and the testimony of the angel. Yeah, we've talked about some other things, but that's all that Luke has directly mentioned. The other pieces come from other gospel records. But Luke has shown there's an empty tomb, and there are these angels who are declaring that Jesus has risen from the dead. Now he records this story in detail about two of the disciples. Remember the disciples who we read in verse 9 and verse 11. And two of these disciples who were on their way to the village called Emmaus, which is about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And these were walking and they were trying to reason about everything that had happened. And just then, Jesus came near and began to walk alongside them. They didn't recognize him. They were prevented from recognizing him. Mark 16, verses 12 and 13 says that he had appeared in a different form. And so they don't recognize Jesus is the very one who's walking alongside them. We don't have all the details of what all that may have looked like and what was involved, except that piece in Mark 16. Now, in verses 17 through 27, Jesus, as he asked them about their exchange of words, you can just imagine they're sorting through all these things that had happened and all these things that that are being reported about, and they stopped walking. They looked discouraged. And one of them, named Clopas, asked if Jesus was the only visitor in Jerusalem who didn't know about what had happened. Certainly, news about Jesus had spread and these things had happened. And it's kind of like asking Jesus, though they didn't know it was Jesus, where have you been this whole time? How is it that you don't know about these things that have been happening? Well, after Jesus asked for clarification, they said they were speaking about the things concerning Jesus of Nazareth. Notice that they confessed Jesus as a powerful prophet in both action and speech before God and all the people. Remember Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 19. There was a prophet who was going to be raised up among the people um, like Moses, okay, or greater than Moses. Jesus was that prophet. But this one who they're confessing to have been this powerful prophet in both speech and action before God and all the people was handed over to receive a death sentence by the Jewish leaders and then be crucified. They confessed they had been hoping he was the Messiah, that he was the one who would redeem Israel. Now, they're probably still likely thinking about all of this from the perspective of an earthly king over an earthly kingdom to redeem Israel. But they had confessed, in essence, that he was the Messiah. That's who they had been hoping him to be. However, it was now the third day since he had been in the tomb. Again, think about the things that had been said leading up to this. Luke 9, verses 21 to 22, Luke 18, verses 31 to 34. Jesus indicated about the third day raising from the dead. Can you imagine being the disciples of Jesus and that you've heard this either directly from Jesus or other people who heard it tell you about it? that Jesus would rise from the dead on the third day, and you don't know all of what that means or would look like, as it's a foreign concept. Now there had been some amazing and confusing reports from the women. Again, these things that were happening in Luke 24, verses 1 through 12. Women have gotten to the tomb's empty. They're reporting about visions of angels and saying that he's not there and that he's risen and all of these things. And they're claiming they didn't find Jesus's body. These visions of angels who said Jesus is alive. And some of their companions, again, think about Peter and John, maybe others, also went to the tomb, and they reported the same thing concerning the empty tomb. And again, imagine being these two disciples. You're traveling to Emmaus and you're trying to sort through all of the events that have transpired and the reports that you've now heard. Jesus then answered them by saying they were foolish and slow of heart to believe all the prophets had spoken. Jesus indicated how it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer in order to enter his glory, to be exalted as king. Go read passages like Psalm 2 and Isaiah 53. You can also read New Testament passages that demonstrate the same thing. 1 Peter 1, verses 10 through 12, and verses 18 through 21, and 1 Timothy 3 and verse 16, and Philippians 2, verses 5 through 11. It was necessary for Jesus to humble himself even to the point of obedience, of death on the cross. And that then through his humility and his obedience in his suffering, would he then be glorified. The prophets had foretold such, and that's exactly what was happening. Jesus then began with Moses and all the prophets and explained all the scriptures concerning himself, the Messiah. Of course, they don't know that at the time, that it is Jesus talking to them. And he's just unpacking the scriptures and all these prophecies so they can understand how it all fits together and pointed to exactly what had happened. In verses 28 through 35, when they came near the village, Jesus indicated he would continue on, but they urged him to stay with them as the day was almost over. And with this, Jesus went and stayed with them. And as they reclined at the table with Jesus, Jesus took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them to eat. And their eyes were opened to recognize him. So whatever had prevented this previously was removed, and now they recognize it's been Jesus the whole time. But he then disappeared from their sight. What an amazing thing to think about as it relates to Jesus, that now he could just vanish out of their sight. That the two disciples then conversed that their hearts had burned within them while Jesus was talking with them on the road and explaining the scriptures to them. It was as if they were spiritually enlightened on their journey to understand the scriptures concerning the Messiah and how Jesus had fulfilled all of those things. Despite the later hour, they returned to Jerusalem to find the 11, the apostles, and those with them. Well, finding the 11, minus Thomas, it would seem, according to John 20, verse 24, it seems the 11, or at least some among them, were proclaiming Jesus' resurrection, though there was also disbelief. Luke 24, verses 37 to 42 will indicate that. Mark 16, verses 12 to 14. And they're proclaiming his appearance to Simon, likely referencing Peter, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 5, that he did appear to Peter. And the two disciples Jesus had revealed himself to in Emmaus then began to describe the events they had just experienced. They had seen the resurrected Christ. Well, as we close this lesson, we see that despite the terrible suffering and death Jesus experienced, God triumphed and glorified Jesus through his resurrection from the dead. This, though, was not a secret event that occurred that nobody knew about. Rather, Luke has demonstrated the tomb was empty and Jesus physically appeared to others.